an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering The Traitor Queen, chapters 15, 16, and 17. Into the wasteland, and then we start part 2 with plans and negotiations and an admission. In these chapters, we find out some pretty fucking crazy info, actually, about what's been going on with the wasteland, and I can honestly say I did not see that coming. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Ashleigh for commissioning this episode. I am really pleasantly surprised at the fact that this series was able to pull out a real shocker like this so late in the game. And what I'm talking about is the fact that Sonea discovers a bunch of stones planted throughout the wasteland that are designed to basically draw life out of it. And her assumption is that it is the traitors who have placed them there. Now, that may be. However, I can't help but wonder if it isn't the Duna, because they were the first ones to have the capacity for making these kinds of stones. And they have a pretty, big axe to grind with T'Chaka and have seemingly been really peaceable about it. But I wouldn't be surprised if they found a sort of more passive way to exact a kind of revenge or punishment. But yeah, it seems like this is the kind of thing that it would have taken years to accomplish. I mean, they don't search that far around, and she finds 3 of them. So how many do you have to place in order to fill up an entire wasteland, worth of property? I'm really curious whether this was done as a means of simply keeping T'Chaka weaker than it had been. If it was more pointed than that. There was also a bit of me that wondered if it was fallout from the original... What's the word I want here? The original disaster, I guess, when that loony magician decided that he was going to blow up the store stone. I was like, did the store stone explode into fragments that embedded themselves in the land? But it just seems like the pieces are too big. They're too purposefully placed, concealed in a really particular way. It just doesn't seem like that could be accidental. That really seems purposeful. And to be honest, regardless of whoever's actually responsible, I'm impressed. That's a pretty great means of creating this sort of weak point that T'Chaka has never really seemed to be able to recover from. So I'm just into it. I love this revelation, and it just truly never occurred to me that it was anything other than what it looked like, which was the reaction to this explosion hundreds of years ago at this point. I am very happy with finding out that it probably started out that way, and then somebody decided that they were going to make a move to ensure it stayed that way. I'm into it, man. I really, really enjoy that. So we shall see who it turns out is responsible. But she jumps to the traitors too quickly. She doesn't know enough to realize that the Duna also have the capacity for this, in terms of their sheer ability to make the stones. So I understand why she thinks that, but I don't know that's correct. I mean, the real main reason that the traitors would be interested in doing this, obviously, is because they are intending to wage war. And there is no better way to like ensure that your enemy is debilitated than to do something like this to keep their supplies down. Now, what I think would be a really interesting follow-up is if amongst their various, traitor spies that are all out there pretending to be slaves, what if they had them planting these things in like the fields and basically cut off a food supply? I mean, that's a pretty brutal way to go, but the seize the means of production, kids. Let's fucking eat the rich here. You are slaves. Like you have all the control. Harvest everything, take off, sow the fucking fields with salt, except that it's like a kind of salt that it's easy to take back once you have won. And they don't necessarily even need to know why everything is dying. They may not be able to piece together what went wrong right away. I'm into it. I really like this. So we'll see. But let me back up. Martin's here in the chat. Hi, Martin. Ashleigh isn't here yet. But she may come. We'll see. Sometimes she can't make it. So let's go into the wasteland where we are with Lorcan. And he's on this horse that insists on trying to ride up into the other horse and bite it, which I just find so funny. I love weird little details like that of just like shit that isn't actually meaningful necessarily. That is to say, it's not meaningful yet. There may be a point later where the fact that the horse causes trouble winds up giving them all away. It might, it may wind up being really important. But as of right now, it just seems like a kind of just a bit of color to remind us that like, this is just their transportation, but they have distinct personalities and can really be a pain in the ass. And he is thinking about whether or not Tyvara is going to be with the traitors. And I kind of wondered myself, I sort of thought maybe she won't be and he'll run into her as a surprise a little bit later. But she is indeed with them, and he is just so overjoyed to see her. And it was honestly like a sweet moment. I haven't been like super into their relationship. I'm not against it or anything. It's just not as compelling with me. And I still was kind of like, oh, that's nice, and he's with his friends and they kind of think that they've come across some traitors, but they're not sure. And there's a really tense moment where he starts to be like, oh my God, what if it's not traitors? What if it's magicians? What if there's like more than one of them? Then what do we do? And he just really spins out of control for a second before they realize that it is Savara. And they said Savara says, oh, it's good to see you, Lorcan. We were worried we might have to break into the palace to get you. We haven't had to do that in centuries. I love that line. It's such a sort of throwaway line, but it's such a also like bit of badassery, really, for lack of a better way of saying that. Like basically being like, oh yeah, I mean, it would have been super inconvenient if you were still in the palace. It wouldn't have been impossible. We could absolutely fucking get to you there. But it would have been kind of a pain. So I'm really glad that we didn't have to stoop to that, Really, that is a baller line that she says. And he has to, he says, I was saddened to hear of the Queen Zarala's passing, but glad to hear of your election. And I keep being a little bit sad that Zarala died. I would have liked Sonea to meet her. Mostly, honestly, because Sonea seemed to have some suspicions as to whether there was anything between Lorcan and Zarala. And I would have liked for her to meet Zarala and realize that, that's probably not what that was. Now, maybe he had something going on with someone else. It's certainly potentially possible. Maybe it was Savara. So let's see. Your mother awaits us on the mountains. She was smiling broadly. I was so relieved the king let you go. Savara said the king wouldn't dare harm you. This is Tyvara, BT dubs. But that didn't stop me worrying. And he says, I'm not the only one who's been let out. and is talking about the fact that she's supposed to be on punishment working in the sewer. And she just is like, well, I have more important things. I'm sure once I go back, they'll resume punishment. And there's a sort of weird silence. And finally she says, was it bad in the king's prison? And he gets really sort of like anxious about telling her the truth about this. He doesn't want to talk about it, understandably, but he isn't going to lie. And he says, it wasn't fun. You must have been through worse as a slave. She said nothing. He made himself look up at her. She met his gaze reluctantly. Then her eyes dropped to the ground. Would that be a problem for you, if I had? She asked. It was an odd way to phrase her answer, but as her meaning came to him, he felt both dismay and affection. And this is such an unfortunate thing. What she's asking is, does the idea of me sleeping with other men, and really, let's be honest, does the idea of me being raped by multiple men, likely, bother you enough that you wouldn't want to be with me? And this is one of those questions that the idea that somebody would ever have to ask this is so horrifying and so deeply upsetting, but it is a reality. I have known women who were raped and their partner left them after. And it's really just one of those that I can't even imagine caring so little about my partner that something like that would get in the way of how I feel about them or feeling protective of them. It's absolutely mind-boggling to me that was even a factor. And yet it was enough for them to like end a relationship, which is just the most selfish, heartless, compassionless thing I've ever heard in my life. And I am glad that we don't like get too far into it, with talking about exactly what it was that happened to her. But I also appreciate that it's being acknowledged by Tyvara, because we have been in Lorcan's head with him realizing like, oh my God, probably she has had to do that. And I wanted to hear it from her, and I wanted to see the way that she talked about it, the attitude that she had about it, which really the attitude she has about it is like, it's my job. And just that sort of she doesn't want to chat about it, which I understand. And she's probably, when she got involved with the traitors and she had to take up this position, I am certain that they warned her that was going to be part of the deal, especially because she's beautiful. I have no doubt that was going to, like, that they knew that was going to come up. They were probably women who like advised her on how to bear it, and it's just such the history of women and what we have had to put up with our treatment over history is something that I don't feel men can ever really truly understand what it's like to like know that our grandmothers and great grandmothers went through things like this. Tyvara is a slave. So, but she was pretending to be. So it was a very particular kind of relationship that she had with the men around her and the way that the law protected her. But even so, years ago, when I was like first breaking out of doing Unspoiled with Brendan and doing it on my own, I was talking about how women who are married off in like the Song of Ice and Fire universe are not necessarily like choosing their husband and don't want to sleep with them. And it was something that I had always sort of been like, well, that's the way it was, and it was part of their duty and whatever. I really sort of took for granted that that was something that you grew up knowing you had to do, and you would just do it, and it wouldn't be a personal, like, it wouldn't get to you the way it does nowadays when there is an expectation of freedom and consent surrounding that. And then I really started to think about it as I like grew and started to understand better. And I realized how for some women, they married somebody with the full knowledge that they would be raped over and over again by this husband. And that was going to be their future now. That was going to be the way that sex was for them. And maybe they didn't even know going into it. Maybe they thought it would be different, and it wasn't. But that so many women were simply seen as a means of continuing a line. And there was no concern about well-being, about their desire, pleasure, consent, anything like that. And we are only barely starting to really get out of those dark ages. It really hasn't changed all that much. The idea of consent is still, for a lot of people, a real gray area. And it's 2020, you would really think that we would have fucking progressed a little bit further than we have by now. But we still defend against people who have, date raped by being like, well, he thought she was into it. That's a fucking excuse anymore. It's not that hard, guys. You just ask. You ask and they tell you, and you ask in a way that doesn't imply violence if they should say no. That's really all it is. But I just can't get over thinking back to how things were hundreds of years ago versus just how they were 30 years ago, and how little we have ever cared about the safety of women. Women have been a prop to be used for justifying a lot of horrific crimes in support of our virtue in this sort of hypothetical, theoretical sense. But whenever it actually comes down to protecting women, we do not care. We just don't. And we haven't ever. And we still don't really. It's only just kind of beginning to seep into the culture that we need to take this stuff more seriously. But, and seeing the way that we are used as a weapon. I mean, especially, for example, within the trans community, there are a lot of cis people who try and assert that trans people are going to try and if somebody is a trans woman, then they're only dressing like a woman so that they can infiltrate spaces meant for women in order to assault them, which BT dubs has never happened. That's not how that works. It's completely invented. But they're trying to point out how concerned they are about us in order to oppress another group, even though they've never been concerned about us. The rate at which rape is actually it's not prosecuted at above I think 20%, and not successfully prosecuted above 5%. It's obscene. Don't pretend you care just because you want to oppress somebody. Stop it. It's embarrassing. You made it up. We know you made it up. You're not fooling anybody. We don't think you care about us. We're not fooled. Stop. And this whole thing with Tyvara, the idea that she went into this knowing that she could be raped by anyone and there is no protection for her of any kind. She's a slave. That's literally what they think she's there for. And they could really harm her. I mean, there are all kinds of injuries that can result from rape that are truly horrific and damaging for life, And to just know that you're putting yourself in a position for this cause where something like that could happen to you and there would be no recourse. Nothing could be really done unless they decided that they were going to try and kill one of the masters or something, which that seems like they'd have to tilt their hand a little bit too much. That's terrifying. That's a really massive personal risk and sacrifice that she took on herself that I don't know if any male traitors would undergo that same sort of risk, knowing that it was potentially going to happen to them. I'm certain that they know that it's a risk potentially, but with women, I think there's much more of a, I'm going to take it for granted that that's likely, So yeah, I found this conversation really I appreciated it. It was also really upsetting. But I also do kind of wish that Lorcan talked to her about what happened to him because he doesn't want to let her know that there was somebody who he sort of like helped to die. And I'm really curious about that girl. You know, I'm wondering if he said something to Tyvara about what really happened. Would she know who he meant? Would she be like, oh, that was so-and-so. I had heard that something happened. Or would she be like, no, as far as I know, there were no traitors working there. And she was just like some random slave. I really would like to know what relationship they had to this person. Yeah, I don't know. Martin says the first time they met, Tyvara started undressing thinking Lorcan would fuck her. Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, she just assumed because that was just such a given. And I just don't really think that, you know, male traitor slaves would necessarily be in that sort of mindset right out of the gate, you know? So this is when she says, do you know where we're going? And he says, to the mountains to meet my mother. And by say, I mean in like a mental. They are communicating mind to mind here because he's holding her hand. And she wonders to herself, what will he do then? And wonders it without actually being able to touch him. Or she wonders this while touching him, but it's like she didn't intend for him to hear it the way she did with the other stuff. And then when she pulls her hand away from him, she thinks he'll change his mind once he knows we're about to go to war. And he hears this without them touching, which isn't supposed to be able to happen. And he tells himself, I must have imagined it. His mind was merely pointing out in an unexpected way that war would make his choice much more difficult. Dude, no. I can't get over how much people in this world want to think they know how magic works. And they keep on ignoring the fact that somebody else figured out a different way to do a thing that you don't know about. And clinging to what they think is possible. It's just so silly. You heard her thoughts a second ago. And this had her exact inflection and probably like tone to it that the other thoughts did. You know what this was. It was not your imagination, Lorcan. Stop it. And then the idea that like, well, Tyvara had been wondering if he wanted to avoid being caught up in a war. No, they have a plan. They know what they're doing. They're going into this negotiation with a specific goal in mind. They're not trying to just open up a fucking trade route, dude. Come on. But yeah, he isn't hearing this properly. And later on, he starts to try and like see if he can sense Sonea's thoughts the way that he was able to with Tyvara, even though they're not touching. And it seems like there is a bit of an impression, but it's not as distinct. It's not words. And I'm very curious about why this is happening to him. Is it possible that like some people, when they are able to access black magic, they can like, you know, open up, can they unlock new abilities? Or is it something to do with like the stone that's like under his skin being connected somehow to like, I don't know. I really don't. But I'm very curious about it. I'm excited about it. That's an interesting development. So then we cut to Lilia. And Lilia is having a hard time with the stress of Sari and Anyi and Gaul being right underneath her feet. She's just constantly worried about them and preoccupied. And she's walking to class and thinking about this whole thing that she's dealing with. And she sees Bakken and a couple of other kids. And she just puts a shield up in case they decide to try any shit with her. And they don't. And I have to admit, I really expected something here. I thought that was pretty good tension. You know, I don't want to watch more bullying, but I just also sort of wanted the tension to break and for them to try something. And the fact that they just watch her the way they do is so much more unnerving to me. So Callan meets her and she realizes that he is not inside the arena. And it turns out that what he's going to do is give her one-on-one practice using black magic. And she says, let's see, I'm trying to find the spot. Okay, yeah. So he says there are tasks that black magicians are required to perform that do not involve the acquisition of magic. Reading minds, making blood rings. While Sonea is absent, many would rather that you were taught to use black magic than that we have only one fully trained black magician in Imardine. So I found it really interesting, the difference in her reaction to him telling her this and mine. Because her reaction is, oh, he's obviously pissed because they think he needs watching. And it seems that's correct. It seems like she had the right impression of what this whole thing was about. But honestly, my first impression was thinking that he was saying they are concerned about the safety of Curalia and they don't think just one of us is enough. And that never even seems to come up in her thoughts. And I don't remember, because Sari, I think, says something later. And maybe Sari thinks the same thing, that it's more of like a defensive issue. But that was the first thing that I thought, was that it was a defensive issue, not about trust. And once she put it that way, I was kind of like, oh, that sounds right too. I bet she's right. And yeah, that's a little bit like, that's insulting, but it's also the kind of thing that when you're practical, you know that they have a point. Like, Callan obviously is a practical man. He doesn't like that they don't trust him, but he also probably is thinking about how he would feel if he were them looking in from the outside at a black magician who is addicted to Roet and being like, yeah, I know that I'm not going to do anything, but I 100% understand why they think that I would do something. So this is when he shows her how to draw power and store it and be able to basically like keep it contained so that nobody around her will be able to sense that the power is there. That's a major thing that I had kind of forgotten about, is the fact that, like, when you have more power than you were naturally producing yourself, it's something that people around you can feel. And I had kind of forgotten the fact that, like, I think Sonea even mentions that when Acheron is, like, you know, going around the place, like there's an aura of power that comes off him that everybody just assumed meant that he was a much more powerful magician than most knew, but nobody realized that it was because he was taking power. So she pulls power from him, and she's like pretty reserved about it because she wants to not hurt Callan or overdo it. And as she continues, he pushes her to take more. She notices how, like, tired and sad he looks. And he mentions to her a little bit later that, like, eventually she's going to have to undergo the experience of being drained and to realize what it feels like and to really know how dangerous it is and that it's not something that you want to have happen to you. And she has to be like, look, I don't know how to tell you this, but I low-key know how that feels because Naki did it to me, and she told me that it hadn't worked, but I could tell that it had worked, and I believed her, but now I know better, and that's what it was. And he really is, in that moment, for just a second, very sympathetic to her, and it's just like, oh, girl, that's bleak. So, yeah, he teaches her how to, like, essentially veil the power that she's storing. And I'm trying to find, here it is. Now it is also possible for another magician to sense the taking of magic. This is a similar problem of leakage, but it happens at the site of the wound. You need to extend your barrier a little to overlap that of the donor magic. Following his instructions, Lilia managed to succeed in this lesson after a few attempts. After that, Callan had her attempt to take magic so slowly that he barely noticed, then as quickly as she could. He was able, haltingly, to speak to her during the first, but obviously had trouble staying upright during the second. And that's pretty brutal. Like, the fact that he has to submit himself to this is rough. But then they start talking about what could potentially happen, you know, with the fact that they had been just touching before and able to, like, share power with doing sort of a weird version of black magic. He says, you'll only have to acquire magic this way from non-magicians or an enemy magician. Normal transferal of power can be done without cutting the skin. The weakening effect is also an advantage in battle. I can't see many situations where taking power forcibly while avoiding the weakening effect will be of much use. And she mentions, like, magicians who are dying with that whole potential for there to be an explosion. He says it would be kinder if they didn't have to experience the weakening. And I'm like, but they're already dying. Aren't they already going to feel the weakening? But I guess it would just be that much worse. So then she says, what do you do if you don't have a knife? Could you use magic to make the cut? And I have been sort of wondering this. I have constantly been a little bit surprised that as much as we can use, like, we can use magic to float around, we can use magic to do all sorts of things, and we can take magic from each other, like, even through the skin if it's given willingly, that there isn't a way to initiate this breaking of the barrier of skin without having to actually have a physical knife on you. And it looks like we're finally going to maybe start leveling up in that department. He says, even if a magician is too weak to shield, so long as they're alive, they still contain some energy and a barrier to their skin. At its most basic, that barrier is a shield against another's will and must be broken. And she says, but if you shaped magic into a sliver of force and sent it out from yourself like a strike, overcoming the barrier, would it work? And he is surprised by this and had not thought of it, which, you know, I guess it makes sense that he wouldn't have thought of it because he's, like, not trying to use this shit in battle. Like, he knows it's potentially just going to be required of him, but he isn't trying to think about being aggressive with it, I think is what it is. He's using this as a defensive. And so coming at somebody with that intention hadn't really entered his mind. However, I will say that it's surprising to me that apparently none of the Achadi have figured this out. I mean, unless they have and we just haven't seen it. But I don't think that we have seen any Sechakans manage to make a cut with magic. It's always been with a knife. Am I correct about that? And considering that they mainly practice this type of magic, the fact that they haven't, like, figured out a way to create a type of, like, magic blade is surprising. You would really expect them to be on that shit. And this sort of harkens back to, like, how strange it sort of is, actually, that the battles that we've seen with the magicians have just been a straight up, like, somebody overpowering another in a very vague sort of, like, standing up against one another on the field of battle face to face. There's never a similarity to the way that they fight with the way that people who don't have magic would fight. There is no analog to the kinds of weapons that somebody would normally use. We never hear about a real military presence at all, right? I think Imardin just completely depends on its magicians, if I'm not mistaken. I find that to be kind of strange. You know, the idea that nobody has figured out ways to imitate weapons that are already out there to accomplish certain kinds of attacks, because you don't always just want to kill somebody. And they're going to be, you know, I don't know. It's sort of a weird thing. I mean, I have always been kind of underwhelmed by the way that this author approaches writing battles in the first place. So it sort of follows that she wouldn't give a ton of thought to the ways in which people could attempt to attack each other. But it is a huge oversight in a way that something like this isn't already available. So he says, yeah, that's enough for today. We're going to need somebody for you to practice on. Once you have achieved that skill, I'll need you to learn how to make a blood gem. And Lilia is like, oh, shit, that's pretty fun. So he says that he will meet her back there tomorrow. And then we cut over to Sonea. And her and Regin are hunkered down, expecting the traitors at any moment. It's been a lot longer than they thought it was going to be, though. And, you know, it makes sense once we realize that they're sort of waiting for Lorcan. Like, shit with Lorcan didn't exactly go to plan. And that's probably part of the reason why they're late. So, you know, the two of them are... She can tell that Regin is sort of like, are you sure you want to stay another night? He's not totally convinced that they're actually going to show up. But yeah, here it is. So I like this when she's talking about how different it is to travel here now than it was with Acheron. Across the slopes of the mountains with no supplies, no home, and with Echani hunting them. This time she and Regin had traveled northwest, still across the harsh mountainside, but with plenty of food, no Echani to worry about, and a guild waiting to welcome them home. Still, the wasteland was a harsh place. Below, the rocky slopes plunged into dunes stretching off toward the horizon. The first day they'd waited here, they'd watched a sandstorm move across the land to the north, obscuring all in its path. They'd been worried that they would have to endure the storm, but it died out when it hit the northern mountains. Martin is commenting. I think it's because the Black Magicians has enough power to create a barrier powerful enough to overcome any surprise attack. But overall, I do agree with you. It's like saying, why doesn't Thor worry about attacks from civilians? Yeah. I mean, it's not even really about, like, them trying to use, like, the thing with trying to figure out how to make that kind of, like, knife attack isn't even really necessarily about attack in battle or that kind of, like, concern. I'm just thinking about, like, the pure convenience of it. If you have to take power all the time, wouldn't you want to not have to carry a knife around? Like, that's like the marker of these Echani or Echani or Ashaki. Echani is the first name of the guy who's friends with God. These names are all too similar, man. That's friends with Daniel, right? That's Echadi. Ashaki is the title of the masters who are also magicians. Okay, I think. The mark of an Ashaki is the knife that they have on their waist. And really, when you think about it, that's weird. They shouldn't need that. Like, they should have figured out a way to cut skin easily without even needing a knife. One would really think if you depend on that for your source of magic outside of yourself, that would just be a practical thing that you would enjoy being able to do easily. That it wouldn't, you know, I understand the kind of symbolism of it and wanting to maybe hold on to the, what's the word I want? The tradition of continuing to carry a knife for the marker. But really, in a practical way, it's bizarre that they haven't figured out a way to do this that isn't an attack specifically, but simply a means of, like, sort of forging a magical blade out of thin air. Martin says, if I recall, it's briefly mentioned in the prequel book that the knives are quite rare, so it's a bit of a status symbol. Oh, I don't remember that. Okay. I don't know. Is that still true? It seems like they all just have them now. Because you don't need a special knife, do you? You just need a knife. Like, anybody could have a knife, I would think. How are they rare? Like, then it's not like you need a magical knife. You just need to be able to cut skin. Isn't that right? So why would they be rare? Unless it's like only certain magicians are allowed to carry one, which is a different thing. But that's weird. I don't really get that. So at this point, she's like, Regin's saying, at least we have plenty of water and it's clean now. She followed his gaze. The trickle of water seeped through a crack in the rocky ground and gathered in a small, smooth pool before brimming out over into a tiny stream. The water had obviously been attracting animals. When they'd arrived, they'd had to wash away accumulated bird droppings. The stream did not continue for long, swallowed up by a crevasse in the rocky ground. Standing up, she walked to the pool and regarded it. Clearly the wasteland had some water, but even here, right by the spring, there was no life. She crouched beside it and dipped her hand in the pool. Concentrating, she sought the scattered sense of energy within water that came from ever-present tiny life forms in it. Nothing. She frowned. When they'd arrived, she'd checked if the water was safe to drink. Despite the bird droppings, the water had been pure, which was odd. Perhaps a traitor came by just before we arrived and drew all the energy out. The smaller and less sophisticated a living thing was, the weaker the natural barrier against magical interference. Even trees could be drained of magic without their bark being cut, though the magic came slowly, and there was never as much as in an animal or a person. Fresh water should quickly add more life forms. She reached up to the trickle that fed the pool. Cupping her hands to collect some water, she concentrated again. There, like tiny pinpoints of light. She let the gathered water drop into the pool. There could only be one explanation. Something was killing off all life once it entered the pool. Was it poisoned? They'd been drinking from it for a few days. What could kill off life forms instantly but not affect people? So she starts to dig around in this, like, in the bottom of the pool. And finally she senses something and sees that there is like a bump in the bottom of like the bowl where the water is collected. And she asks Regin for a knife or something for gouging. And he comes back and has a pen. That's literally it. No knife. Look. The whole thing is supposed to be that Sonea as a black magician would have been safer here than other magicians would be because she could defend herself. How are you going to send a black magician out into fucking T'Chaka and not give her a knife? If we haven't figured out how to do this yet? Why would you do that? Yes, she has collected power, but why? Like, he offers on the way in the carriage to like let her draw magic from him again. What if she needed it out here in the middle of nowhere where you're totally exposed? In my opinion, a much likelier place to need extra magic than in the carriage. Why would they not have a knife? He says, I'm afraid so. Nobody expects magicians to need knives. She's a black magician, though. That's the whole thing, guys. What are you talking about? I mean, yeah, I don't know. It's a weird moment that doesn't make sense to me. So she finally digs it out and pulls it up. And there is a uncut crystal. And she realizes, she says, it's one of the Traitor's magical gemstones. I doubt the Duna come this far south. I'm like, why? Why wouldn't they do something like this in order to like get at the people who tried to like enslave them, basically? I mean, you know? If the Achani know about them, they'd have used them on us 20 years ago. Which, that's probably true. That is a good point. When the Traitors arrived, she would need to have already considered all the implications of her discovery. She might not need to tell Regin to seek his opinion, but she wanted to. It is, I suspect, a black magic gemstone. So that's why the wasteland never recovered. If they can make one, then they can make hundreds, thousands. Strewn across the land, they must be slowly but relentlessly sucking away life. The soil becomes too infertile for plants. Larger, more sophisticated living things starve or move away. For centuries. And Regin says, we can't be sure it was the traitors. They may have just put the stone here to keep the water clean. She looked up at him. I reckon I could find more stones if any are about. So when he says they might have just put this here to keep the water clean, I gotta tell you guys, that's how naive I am, is when she finds this stone, I 100% thought this was a stone planted here just for that purpose, because of the fact that the traitors tell her to meet them there. She thinks to herself about the fact that they followed the instructions and they are at the exact spot that the traitors told them to meet them. So what I thought was they directed them to a spot that had been altered in order to make it more friendly to visitors, and that they would be like, oh yeah, there's a source of water there that will be good for them, and we'll make sure that, So when he says that's why the wasteland never recovered, for me that was a big leap. I was taken very off guard by that, and I was like, wait, oh, are they thinking this is everywhere? And then he asserts we can't be sure of that. But by the time he says, by the time he starts to argue that maybe it's just to clean the water, I was already so firmly on board with the original assertion that he made that then I was scoffing at the idea that that's all it was. So yeah, she says that she reckons she could find more. She closed her eyes and expanded the natural barrier around her skin until it was a globe. Where it overlapped with the rock beneath her feet, she weakened it so that magic began to seep out. Then she began to walk forward slowly. She had only taken 50 or so paces when she felt the faintest pull. It was an illusion, the sense of no resistance where everywhere else there was one. Stopping, she turned, and after losing the sense a few times, managed to narrow down the area the pull was coming from to a few paces in diameter. Regin joined her as she poked around a stone-filled crack between two sheets of stone. She began sweeping her barrier down the length of the gap, but before she had gone far, Regin gave a crow of triumph and held something up. Another dark, glossy crystal. Taking it from him, she tested it. The magic she sent toward it was drawn into the stone. So she goes and tries to find another one, all in sheltered positions where water might collect or flow through, nooks and cracks where life might take root. So she calls up Osen, and she thinks about the fact that, like, maybe she should tell Lorcan, and then she's like, ooh, he might actually know about this already, which is a weird thought. Like, we know that he doesn't, but it makes sense that she would think maybe he does. Maybe they told him. Once the guild knew, the traitors would gain nothing from killing her and Regin. Taking Osen's ring from her pocket, she sat down, leaned against a boulder, and slipped it on her finger. So we are going into part 2 at this point, and we have Sari, and I'm not going to talk too much about what's going on with Sari and Anya. Suffice it to say, and Gol, that they are planning on setting this trap and using this like means of collapsing the network of tunnels in order to perhaps trap either Skellen or Larandra, depending on who gets sent, if they make it known where they are. They're going to try and lure this dude in. And let's see. He and Gol hadn't told Anya their plans to reveal Skellen to the guild using non-magical means. Sari wasn't entirely sure he understood what the bodyguard had described. It was a method used in mines that could cause a collapse big enough to open up a hole in the guild gardens. Gol was confident it would work. Skellen and his men would either be buried or exposed to any magicians who happened to be about. There was, however, a considerable danger that Sari, Gol, and Anya would be buried too. Sari had told Anya that if Skellen found them before the guild agreed to the trap, she should run and fetch Lilia. She'd been reluctant to agree until he'd pointed out that there would be nothing left to be gained by her staying. So, we should get Lilia to strengthen the rooms. And Anya says she's got plenty of magic right now. Callan's been teaching her how to use black magic and store power. So he says something about how he's worried that maybe Callan isn't teaching her as adequately as he should be if he's planning to abuse his power. But there's no indication, that has been happening. And I like to think that Lilia would be able to sense if he was not teaching her the proper way to do things. But, who knows? She might be able to be fooled. But yeah, I don't think that's something that we have to worry about. I will say that I feel bad for the fact that Callan is under so much suspicion. As much as I have suspected him throughout so much of this book, because it just felt like he was sort of being set up to be a problem and a bad guy, I feel a little sad about the fact that so much of that is simply based on him being an addict, and I understand the reality of that, trust me. Me and the whole reality of what addiction is like go way back. My family, yikes. So I understand why people feel that way and why it would be created, it would be used as a sort of weak point for him. But it's a bummer, I feel bad about it. So then we go to Daniel. Daniel's really there's not a ton going on with him initially. He's doing his thing where he's copying his notes. Maria is complaining about the fact that she's super bored because basically they are in disgrace. And so the magicians that would normally come and visit them and invite them to their place to eat and have conversations and whatnot, none of that is happening anymore. And he tells her there are a few traders who travel between Sachaka and Aline or Kirelia a couple of times each year, and they carry goods for us. And that's how he's been getting messages to the guild. And otherwise, he's been using Osen's blood ring. She says, so you need to rewrite this whole thing in a code and then send lots of copies via different couriers to Osen to ensure he gets at least one, then give Osen the key to the code via his blood ring. And Daniel is like, oh shit, that's a really, really good idea. So yeah, it looks like he may actually decide to use this method. Do you think there's any chance the Ashaki might be about to attack the traders or the traders attack Ashaki? Why? Have you heard rumors? Not anything specific, but my friends often discuss the possibility, and King Amakira was so determined to get information out of Lorcan. It'll be ironic if the traders do attack and defeat the Ashaki. All the king's efforts, and Lorcan refusing to speak, will have been for nothing, because then it won't matter if Sanctuary's location has been revealed. Anyway, I guess you're going to be making more copies of your notes now. Let me know if you'd like someone to help. And later on, Tyen comes in for the discussion between Daniel and Achati. And Achati essentially tells them that Lorcan gave away more than he intended when he told them where because so it's sort of weird, honestly. I'm not sure that I buy this, but the whole thing that he says is, Lorcan agreed to tell us where the trader's home was, and he did do that. I think that he thought that he was getting one over on us, and that he had sort of tricked us and managed to not give us any relevant information, but he underestimated what we were able to get out of what he said. So what Lorcan told them was their home is in Sachaka. And he thought that that was just too big and too vague to really be meaningful. But what the king took from that was they consider themselves to be Sachakan citizens in a way, and they therefore would be totally willing to try and take over, because as far as they are concerned, Sachaka is also their country. And I guess. I don't know, guys. It doesn't, like, that doesn't really work for me in terms of what, like, that being satisfactory to the king. You know what I mean? I don't know. This whole, like, bit here, it's a weird idea that Daniel eventually is like, oh, I see that Achadi was able to sort of manipulate all of us so that we each got something that was, like, sort of satisfactory, but none of us were totally happy with the way things worked out. But honestly, that means that we all wound up in a pretty decent position. Everybody should be, like, not quite pleased with the way things went. And I'm not entirely sure that Achadi, like, deserves all of that credit. I also, the way that, like, the fact that we don't see Lorcan giving the information and we just hear about it secondhand, for me, I feel like indicates that the author kind of knew that the deal that Lorcan was making wouldn't read totally believably if we saw it on the page. He's just like, you know, we get to see him be like, what if I told you where the traitors lived? But that's it. We don't actually see what he says, and we just find it out secondhand. And when it turns out to be somewhat underwhelming, I was a little disappointed because I thought that she wasn't letting us see what he said so that she could, like, pull out a bit of a surprise later and be like, oh, look what this clever sausage did. But no, he just kind of thought he was, like, giving them a bit of a riddle or, you know, the finger. And then it turns out that they were like, oh, well, we just wanted to know if they would be willing to wage war on us. Like, you sort of did know that, though, didn't you? Like, the whole, it's just been ramping up. You had to be aware of it. I just don't really feel that the information Lorcan gives is enough to have satisfied anybody. But regardless, that's the way, like, and Daniel seems really impressed with Achadi, and I was kind of like, okay. So this is when we see the conversation between Sonea and the traitors, because they do indeed show up there later than they had intended to be. And Sonea is realizing that this woman is really attractive. Not Savara, Tyvara. She's looking at Tyvara because, yeah, this is the one that her son is into. And they have this conversation that basically is like, okay, we would like to be part of the Allied lands. What are the terms and conditions for that? And they begin to come up with some interesting ideas. So one of the main things is, well, you know what? I'm just going to read this real quick. I'm almost out of time here, but I feel like I've pretty much covered most of the other stuff that's going on here. So this is a good way to wrap up here. So I carry the blood ring of Lord Osen, administrator of the guild. Do you object to me wearing it? No, Savara looked at Lorcan. Begin, Lord Lorcan, because he's going to be the one that's sort of like at the forefront of this. So it turns out that when Zarala said that she had not fulfilled her end of a promise that she had made Acheron, her promise had been to overthrow Sachaka and outlaw slavery, which is pretty fucking huge. That he was like, hey, will you real quick promise to do that? Okay, that's giant, but sure. And she says, Sonea listed the laws with Osen's assistance. And the queen is like, all right, some of those are pretty similar to laws we already follow. The restrictions on knowledge of higher magic, though, we can't do that. Like, that's our whole thing. And we can't make these stones that we find very useful. Like, we're going to need all of that. And finally, Sonea's like, yeah, we anticipated that you wouldn't like that. So our agreement would be they can't learn higher magic until after they have left the university, and only you guys can teach them. And Savara seems to be pretty satisfied with that. And she says, if King Amakira learns of an agreement between us, he will cause us both trouble. He will try to stop your novices reaching us. Savara waved a hand dismissively. Oh, that won't be a problem. Once they're in Kirelia, it will be harder to conceal what's happening. We could disguise them as Elenes. That won't be necessary. And she keeps on basically being like, no, you don't understand. We're really not going to have to worry about that. Which finally, Sonea starts to be like, oh, shit. They just mean they are going to have control of Sachaka by the time this shit rolls around. Which, correct. Yeah, that's exactly what they think. And then they talk about the relative value of what each of them has learned. Because she tries to be like, well, we already know how to use healing magic, so we wouldn't need to go to the guild for that. And Lorcan's like, all right, look, you don't, though. You know the very basics of it, but you can fuck up bad and kill people. And we have in learning how to do it properly. But we have, because of that, gotten the knowledge down. You could either keep acting like you know everything and risk killing some people along the way, or you could take our tutelage on it and learn how to do this totally properly. And regarding stone making, actually, that's not worth as much as healing because you need stones. Healing is just a great thing to be able to know that you can sheerly do with magic, and that's all you need. Stone making, first of all, you need to learn higher magic, which most people aren't going to be super psyched about learning. Second of all, you need a supply of these crystals, which we don't necessarily have. We don't even know if we can get them. We potentially could, but we don't know that. So really what you're offering isn't quite on the level of what we would be offering. And so Savara says, maybe we could exchange healing for stones. Your healers could work for us and the guild would receive stones in exchange. Extending his senses, Lorcan tried again to hear his mother's surface thoughts. What he picked up seemed to be too out of character, however. He must be imagining it. It was odd that he would imagine his mother thinking such a string of curse words, which was very funny. I really wonder, too, because she's got the ring on with Osen listening. So is he just hearing her, like, go off swearing in her own head? And that's pretty much like the majority of their conversation is taken care of there. And then we just get a little bit of like Lilia reinforcing some of their trap in the tunnels using, magical architecture, which is apparently not as popular anymore as it had been because of the attack from the Sachakans, like undoing a lot of that. And people realizing that relying on magic for like their structures to be sound wasn't a great idea. And Lord Rothan comes to visit and basically is like, look, I know that there's a lot of shit going on. I'm aware that Sari is like probably living down there. If you need help, tell me, because I know that it's rough. And also in that vein, we have decided to pull back on how much schooling you need to complete right away because we can see you're pushing yourself really hard and still not making it. And that's getting caught up in a certain time frame isn't as important as like learning things adequately, which I appreciated. So that's about it on this section. So I am going to wrap up, but thank you again to Ashleigh so much for commissioning this episode, and thank you to Martin for hanging out in the chat with me. And I will be seeing you all again pretty soon with a new episode. Until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.